I don't think I noticed the change when it first started. Or maybe I noticed it, but I didn't understand what it meant yet. That's probably closer to the truth. Because when I look back now, the signs feel obvious. Almost painfully obvious. But when you're inside a relationship, things rarely feel obvious in the moment. They feel explainable, temporary, easy to excuse. And that's what I kept doing. Excusing things. Telling myself that nothing had really changed, even though something inside me already knew it had. When we first met, the connection felt unusually easy. Not intense in a dramatic way. Just natural. We met at a friend's birthday dinner. One of those crowded restaurant tables where people squeeze together, pass plates around, and talk loudly over each other. I didn't know most of the people there. She was sitting across from me, laughing at something someone said. Not the loudest laugh at the table, but the kind that made other people smile too. I remember noticing that first. Not what she looked like, not what she was wearing, just the way her laugh felt, relaxed. Like she wasn't trying to impress anyone. Later that night, we ended up walking outside together while everyone else waited for rides. The conversation started in the usual way. Where are you from? What do you do? How do you know the host? Simple things. But there was something about the rhythm of it that felt different. Neither of us was rushing. There were pauses in the conversation that didn't feel awkward. We actually listened to each other. That felt rare. Rare enough that I noticed it immediately. The first few months unfolded the way good beginnings often do. Quietly. We started seeing each other on weekends. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long walks where neither of us wanted to be the first person to say we should go home. Eventually, we stopped pretending those walks were spontaneous. They became part of the routine, and the routine felt good. I remember a night early on when we sat in her car outside my apartment for almost an hour after she dropped me off. The engine was off. The street was quiet. We kept talking about random things that didn't really matter. Music we liked. Places we wanted to travel. Stories from childhood. At one point she laughed and said, "Why are we still sitting here?" I shrugged. "Because we're still talking." She smiled at that. And somehow that small moment felt important. Like we both understood that something real was forming between us. For a while, everything continued like that. The conversations felt easy, curious, alive. We asked each other questions the way people do when they're still discovering who the other person is. Not just polite questions. Real ones. What scares you the most? What kind of life do you actually want? What did you think your life would look like by now? Those kinds of questions. And every answer opened another door. Another story. Another layer. It felt like we were slowly building a map of each other's minds. At some point, the relationship stopped feeling new. But it still felt good. We settled into the ordinary rhythm of being together. Weeknight dinners. Watching shows on the couch. Running errands together on weekends. Those moments didn't feel boring. They felt comforting. There's a kind of intimacy that grows in the ordinary parts of a relationship. When you stop performing. Stop trying to impress each other. You just exist together. And for a while, that kind of quiet closeness felt enough. I'm not exactly sure when the first shift happened. That's the part that's hardest to remember clearly. Because nothing dramatic happened. No fight. No argument. No moment where something obviously broke. Just small changes. Small enough that I kept explaining them away. The first thing I noticed was the conversations. They became shorter. Not suddenly. Gradually. At first I assumed it was stress. Her job had gotten busier around that time. Longer hours. More responsibility. It made sense that she might feel tired in the evenings. So when her responses became a little shorter, I didn't question it. That's what you do in relationships. You give the other person the benefit of the doubt. You assume their behavior has a reasonable explanation. And most of the time, that's a healthy instinct. But sometimes it also becomes a way of ignoring things you don't want to face yet. I remember one night in particular. We were sitting on the couch watching something neither of us cared about very much. I made a comment about a scene in the show. Normally, she would have responded with a joke or a question. That night she nodded. Yeah. Then she looked back at her phone. The moment passed quickly, but something about it stayed with me. Not because it was rude. It wasn't. It just felt different. Like the conversation had lost a little of its energy. Moments like that started happening more often. Still small. Still easy to ignore. But they accumulated. Sometimes I would tell her a story about something that happened during my day, and she would respond politely but briefly. Sometimes she would laugh at something on her phone but hesitate before sharing it with me. Sometimes we would sit together in silence longer than we used to. And each time I told myself the same thing. This is normal. Long relationships calm down. The excitement fades. People become comfortable. I repeated that explanation often enough that it almost convinced me. Almost. But there was a different feeling underneath those explanations. Something quieter. Something harder to name. It felt like I was watching the emotional distance between us expand, 1 inch at a time. So slowly that it never seemed urgent enough to confront. One evening, we were having dinner at her apartment. She was telling me about a meeting she had earlier that day. I listened the way I always did, nodding, asking a question here and there. But halfway through her explanation, I realized something strange. She wasn't really talking to me. Not intentionally, but the way she spoke felt distant, like her thoughts were somewhere else. Her words were reaching me, but the feeling behind them wasn't. That's a strange sensation. You hear someone's voice. You understand their sentences, but you feel like you're not actually inside the conversation anymore. Just nearby. Later that night, we went to bed. She fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake longer, staring at the ceiling. And one thought kept returning. I think she's losing interest. The thought felt harsh when it first appeared. Too harsh. So I pushed it away. I told myself I was overthinking things. People have quiet phases in relationships. Not every moment needs to feel exciting. But even after I pushed the thought away, it kept returning. Not loudly, just quietly waiting in the background. The next few weeks continued in that same uncertain rhythm. We still saw each other, still shared meals, still spent evenings together. From the outside, nothing about the relationship looked broken. But inside it, something felt thinner. Like the emotional thread that connected us had started fraying. There were still moments that confused me. Sometimes she would reach for my hand while we were walking. Sometimes she would lean against my shoulder while we watched a movie. Those moments gave me hope. They made me question my own perception. Maybe I'm imagining the distance. Maybe things are fine. Maybe this is just what stability feels like. Those thoughts kept the uncertainty alive longer than it probably should have been. But there was one detail I couldn't ignore. Curiosity. When we first started dating, she had been curious about me. She asked questions. Not surface-level questions. Real ones. The kind that make you pause and think before answering. At some point, those questions stopped. Not abruptly, just gradually. She stopped asking about my thoughts. Stopped asking what I was worried about. Stopped asking what I wanted from the future. And once I noticed that change, it became impossible to unnotice. Because curiosity is one of the quiet signs of interest. When someone stops being curious about your inner world, something important has already shifted. I didn't say anything about it. Not at first. Part of me was afraid of sounding insecure. Another part of me was afraid that asking the question might confirm the answer. So instead, I stayed quiet. And the distance continued growing in small, almost invisible ways. One night we were sitting in her car after dinner. The same situation where we used to talk for an hour before saying goodbye. But this time the silence felt different. Not comfortable. Not shared. Just quiet. She looked tired. I looked out the windshield at the empty street. And for the first time, neither of us tried to start another conversation. After a minute she said, "I should probably get going." I nodded. Yeah. That was it. A 2-minute goodbye where there used to be an hour of conversation. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it was dramatic. Because it wasn't. It was so ordinary that it felt almost invisible. But inside that small moment was a realization I couldn't ignore anymore. The closeness we used to have was fading. Not suddenly. Slowly. Like a light dimming so gradually you barely noticed the room getting darker. The realization finally became clear one evening a few weeks later. We were sitting on the couch again. She was scrolling through her phone. I was staring at the television without really watching it. At one point she laughed quietly at something she read. For a moment I expected her to show me. The way she used to. But she didn't. She just kept scrolling. And I remember thinking something that felt strangely calm. She's already drifting away. Not physically. Not officially. But emotionally. Like part of her had already stepped outside the relationship. And the rest of her was slowly following. The conversation that ended things happened a few weeks after that. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No accusations. Just honesty. She said she had been feeling distant. I admitted that I felt it too. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, we both understood something simple. The connection that once felt effortless had quietly faded. When I left her apartment that evening, I felt surprisingly calm. Sad, but calm. Because by the time we said the words out loud, the truth had already been sitting between us for months. Sometimes relationships don't end because something explodes. Sometimes they end because interest slowly fades. Not out of cruelty. Not because someone did something wrong. Just because the quiet curiosity that once pulled two people toward each other gradually disappears. And when that curiosity disappears, the rest of the relationship eventually follows. Sometimes I still think about that period. Not the breakup. The months before it. The time when I could feel her losing interest, but didn't fully understand what I was feeling yet. That strange space where the relationship still exists, but the closeness has already started leaving. And sometimes I wonder how many relationships end that way. Not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet shift that two people feel long before they finally admit it out loud. I don't know the answer. I just know that by the time we said goodbye, part of her had already left a long time before. Sometimes I still think about that idea. Not the breakup itself, but the part before it. The part where the relationship still technically existed, even though something important inside it had already started fading. Because that part is harder to understand. When people talk about breakups, they usually talk about the moment everything ends. The conversation, the argument, the last goodbye. But in my experience, the real ending often starts much earlier. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, and for a long time, you keep participating in the relationship as if nothing has changed, even though you can already feel something shifting underneath it. There was a period, maybe the last couple of months before we ended things, where I started noticing how differently we experienced time together. Not dramatically, just small things. We would go out to dinner, and the conversation would stay on the surface. Work updates, funny stories, plans for the weekend. Everything sounded normal. But underneath it, there was a strange absence. We weren't asking each other new questions anymore. We weren't discovering anything about each other that we didn't already know. We were just maintaining the connection. Like two people watering a plant that had already stopped growing. One evening stands out more than the others. We were walking through a small park near her apartment. The same park where we had spent hours during the first few months of the relationship. Back then those walks felt endless. Every few steps one of us would start another story, or ask another question, or bring up some random thought that turned into a long conversation. But that evening felt different. We walked the entire length of the park without saying much at all. Not because anything was wrong, just because nothing seemed urgent enough to say. At one point a dog ran past us chasing a ball. She smiled. I smiled. We both watched it for a second. Then we kept walking. And I remember thinking something that surprised me. A year ago, we would have talked about that dog for 5 minutes. Now it was just something we noticed, separately. That realization stayed with me. Not in a painful way. More like a quiet observation. Like noticing the temperature of a room changing slowly. You don't react immediately, but you can feel that something is different. Another thing I started noticing was the way she talked about the future. Not the distant future, just the near one. Weekend plans, trips with friends, things happening at work. At some point, those plans stopped including me automatically. Not deliberately. She didn't say, "I'm going without you." She just described things as if I wasn't part of the picture anymore. And each time that happened, I felt a small pause inside myself. Not jealousy. Not anger, just the quiet awareness that something about the way she imagined her life had shifted slightly. Like the space where I used to exist in those plans had slowly moved outward. I don't think she did that consciously. At least it never felt intentional. That's the strange thing about interest fading. It doesn't usually happen as a decision. It happens gradually. Your attention shifts. Your curiosity softens. Your emotional energy starts moving in other directions. And by the time you notice it clearly, part of the connection has already loosened. There was one moment that felt especially clear to me. We were sitting in a small cafe one afternoon. The kind of quiet place where people work on laptops and talk softly. She was telling me about someone new at her office. A coworker who had just started a few weeks earlier. The way she described him wasn't inappropriate. Nothing about the story crossed a line. But I noticed something in the way she talked. There was energy there. Curiosity. Interest. The same tone she used to have when she talked to me in the beginning. And for a moment, I felt something that surprised me. Not jealousy. Recognition. Like I was hearing a version of her voice that I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. That moment didn't start an argument. I didn't accuse her of anything, because nothing had actually happened. But it clarified something that had been slowly forming in my mind. Interest isn't something people can fake forever. When someone is genuinely curious about you, it shows in small ways. The way they ask questions. The way they listen. The way their attention moves toward you instead of drifting away. And when that curiosity fades, the relationship can continue for a while, but the emotional center of it starts shifting somewhere else. After that day, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was normal. Not because I wanted the relationship to end, because pretending otherwise started feeling dishonest. Not with her, with myself. I could feel the distance. And once you recognize that feeling clearly, it becomes impossible to unrecognize it. The strange part is that the relationship didn't collapse immediately after that. We kept seeing each other, kept having dinner, kept texting during the day, but something inside me had changed. I stopped expecting the closeness to return, stopped waiting for the conversations to suddenly feel the way they used to. And that shift made the remaining weeks feel different. Calmer, almost peaceful, like I had quietly accepted something before we had even talked about it. The final conversation came on a Sunday afternoon. We were sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee. Sunlight was coming through the window. Everything looked normal, ordinary. She was the one who spoke first. I feel like something between us has changed. Her voice sounded thoughtful, not defensive, not sad, just honest. I remember nodding almost immediately, because hearing her say that out loud felt like confirmation of something I had already been feeling for weeks. We talked for a long time after that, about the beginning of the relationship, about the last few months, about the distance we had both noticed but hadn't fully named yet. And somewhere in that conversation, the truth became clear. Neither of us had done anything wrong. The interest that once connected us had simply faded. When I left her apartment that evening, I walked for a long time before going home. The city was quiet. Streetlights reflected on the pavement after a light rain earlier that day. And as I walked, I kept thinking about something simple. Interest is a fragile thing. You can't force it to stay. You can't negotiate with it. You can only notice when it's there and when it starts quietly disappearing. Now, when I think about that relationship, I don't remember the breakup as the most important moment. What stays with me more clearly are the small moments before it. The shorter conversations, the quiet walks, the evenings on the couch where the space between us felt just a little wider than before. Those were the moments when the relationship was already changing, even if neither of us fully understood it yet. Sometimes people imagine that breakups happen suddenly, that there's a clear turning point, a single moment where everything shifts. But that's not how it felt for us. It felt slower, more subtle, like standing on a shoreline while the tide slowly moves away. You don't notice the exact moment the water starts pulling back. You just look up eventually and realize the distance between you and the ocean has grown. And sometimes I wonder if she felt the same thing I did during those last months. If she sensed her interest fading before she could explain it. If she noticed the silence growing between us the same way I did. I've never asked. And at this point, I probably never will. Because whatever answers exist now belong to the past version of both of us. The people we were when the relationship was slowly coming apart. What I do know is this. Losing interest doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just a series of small moments. Shorter answers. Fewer questions. A little less curiosity about the person sitting right next to you. And those small moments accumulate quietly. Until one day, you realize the connection that once felt natural now feels distant. And by the time you finally say the words out loud, part of the relationship has already been gone for a long time. And the strange thing is, once I started recognizing those small moments, I began remembering others that I had ignored before. Not because they were unimportant, because they were too easy to explain away at the time. When you care about someone, your mind becomes very good at protecting the relationship from uncomfortable interpretations. You assume the best. You assume the silence means comfort. You assume the distance is temporary. You assume things will circle back. And sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. There was a night, maybe a month before we ended things, when we went to a small restaurant we both liked. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where we had gone dozens of times before. The kind of place where the waiter recognizes you and doesn't bother asking what you want to drink anymore. At first, the evening felt normal. We talked about work, about a trip one of her friends was planning, about a movie we had both been meaning to watch. The conversation moved along politely, smoothly, but somewhere in the middle of it, I realized something strange. I wasn't excited to tell her anything. Normally, when something interesting happened during my day, I couldn't wait to share it with her. Even small things. A weird interaction at work. A funny text from a friend. A random thought that popped into my head while walking somewhere. Those little stories used to feel important because she was the person I wanted to tell them to. But that night I noticed that instinct was gone. Not completely, just quieter. Like the part of me that used to reach for her first had slowly stopped doing that. And that realization made something inside me feel heavier than I expected. Because interest fading doesn't only happen on one side. Sometimes it happens to both people at the same time. Just slowly, quietly, without either of you noticing when it started. After dinner, we walked back to her apartment. It was late enough that most of the streets were empty. The air felt cool. At one point, she slipped her hand into mine. The gesture felt familiar, comfortable, but there was a strange awareness underneath it. Like we were both repeating a movement that belonged to an earlier version of the relationship. Not because it was false, because it used to mean more. That night we sat on the couch again. The same couch where so many evenings had passed. The television was on. Neither of us was really watching it. She leaned against the armrest. I sat a little closer to the middle. At some point she laughed quietly at something on her phone. Then she set it down and looked at me. For a moment it felt like she was about to say something important. But instead she just smiled faintly and asked, "Do you want another drink?" I shook my head. "No, I'm good." She nodded. Then the silence returned. And I remember realizing something very clearly in that moment. We were both avoiding something. Not intentionally, but instinctively. Like two people walking around the same object in a room without acknowledging it. Because once you acknowledge it, you have to deal with it. That's the strange part about relationships when interest starts fading. The truth is often present long before either person says it out loud. It exists in the pauses, in the shorter conversations, in the moments where you both feel the distance but choose not to name it yet. Not because you're dishonest, because you're not ready. For a while, I wondered if I should have said something earlier. Maybe if I had asked the right questions sooner, things might have changed. Maybe the distance could have been addressed before it grew so large. But the older I get, the less convinced I am that relationships work that way. Because curiosity and interest aren't things you can negotiate back into existence. They either live in the connection, or they slowly fade away. And once they fade, no conversation can fully recreate them. The last few weeks of the relationship felt almost peaceful. Not because everything was fine, because the uncertainty had disappeared. When you're still trying to convince yourself that nothing is wrong, the relationship feels tense. You're constantly watching for signs, constantly interpreting small moments. But once you accept what's happening, the tension fades. You stop waiting for things to return to what they were. You just move through the remaining time together quietly. And that's what those weeks felt like. Two people slowly approaching a truth they both already understood. I remember one evening when we were sitting on her balcony again. The same place where we had spent so many nights talking during the beginning of the relationship. The air was cool. The city lights flickered in the distance. For a while neither of us said anything. And strangely, the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt honest. Like we were finally experiencing the relationship exactly as it was. Not trying to recreate what it used to be. Not pretending something was different. Just sitting together in the quiet space that remained. At one point she said something softly. I think we've both felt it for a while. I looked at her. I didn't ask what she meant. Because I already knew. And she knew that I knew. That's the strange language of long relationships. Sometimes the most important things don't need to be explained anymore. They're just understood. After that, the conversation happened naturally. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just honest. We talked about the beginning. About how easy everything had felt back then. About the small ways the connection had changed. And somewhere in that conversation, the relationship quietly reached its end. When I left her apartment that night, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt something closer to acceptance. Because by the time we said the words out loud, the emotional truth had already been living between us for months. Sometimes relationships don't end with a moment. They end with a long realization that both people slowly arrive at. Now, when I think back on that time, what stands out the most isn't the breakup. It's the subtle way interest disappeared. Not in a dramatic collapse. In small shifts. Fewer questions. Shorter conversations. A little less curiosity about the person sitting next to you. Those things seem insignificant when they happen once. But over time they add up. Until one day you realize the connection that once felt alive now feels distant. And sometimes, when I sit quietly late at night, I still think about the moment I first noticed that change. Not the day we broke up. The earlier one. The moment when I could feel her interest slowly slipping away, even though neither of us had said it yet. At the time, I didn't understand what that feeling meant. Now I do. It was the beginning of the end. Not sudden, not dramatic. Just the quiet realization that something we once shared so easily was no longer reaching both of us the same way anymore. And by the time we finally admitted it, part of her had already started leaving long before either of us said goodbye.